What's up guys, you're watching Life ITCG. Today's video, Pauper. I think my last few videos have all been about Pauper, but never mind, it's a cool format. I hope you guys like it. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, Expedition map recently banned in Pauper. And of course, the reason why this card was banned is because it powers up the Urza Tron decks. It lets you find, tower, mine, power plant, whichever one you need, so you can consistently get that 7 mana. So with this gone, you might think that the Tron deck has become significantly weaker, and in a way it has. But the important thing to consider is that in some matchups having that big boost of mana is important, and in some matchups it's not really. So when you think about how you win versus like the very aggro decks, like Stompy or Affinity for example, often the way that you do that is by chaining off some fog effects like combat prevention around turn like 4 to 5, and from there, you can play Stonehorn once, then next turn maybe you teachings for Ephemerate, and so on and so on. And of course you can do all that on like a normal mana curve. You play Stonehorn on turn 4, turn 5 you play another land, then you teachings for Ephemerate, then you flicker your Stonehorn, and so on and so on. So against the the really aggro decks, actually using a map to get a super early Urza Tron setup is not super important. The matchups where it does really matter is firstly is the mirror, because when you have a lot of mana fast, it lets you punk out your opponent by blowing up their lands with Denrova Horror really quickly. So that's obviously important, but obviously in the mirror your opponent has also lost their maps, so it's like an even trade. And then the other matchups where you value having a lot of mana very fast, the blue matchups like Delver, especially Delver, and to a lesser extent sort of blue control decks, because once you get that mana fast, it lets you play around their counters with your flashback spells, or just like multi-spelling in one turn to overload their mana. So like if you play, all your cards are like a little bit overcosted because you're trying to play expensive spells because you have the mana ramp off your Urza lands. So if you play like a very expensive spell and then they use 2 mana to counter it and get in with the ninja, then that's a good exchange for them. But if you have double the amount of their mana, you play one powerful card, then they counter it, and then they've run out of mana because they spent it all on that counter, but you still have like 4 or 5 mana left over, so you play another big spell like a Mulldrifter or anything like that, and then you get ahead that way. So those are the matchups where you want maps to help you get your mana online quickly. But the thing is that all of those blue-based counterspell matchups have got much worse. Well, not the matchups gotten worse, but those decks have gotten worse because Mystic Sanctuary was also banned. So they have a much less reliable late game now. Before, what they could do is basically get like 4 or 5 lands, and then just use Tragic Lesson to skip their land drops in exchange for drawing more cards. So they'd like never run out of gas and always keep counterspells stocked, and like keep the pressure on and counter your spells, and you'd get squeezed out of the game. But like without Mystic Sanctuary, they can't do that anywhere near as reliably anymore. So it's not so imperative that you get a whole bunch of mana really quickly to overload their counters. You can sort of like wait them out a bit, because they have not so much control over their draws anymore, to make sure that their hand is totally stocked full of counters. So with those things considered, the map ban doesn't actually hurt Tron all that much, and it's still a pretty viable deck. And the challenge that was just today, so probably for most people that was Saturday the 26th of July. Had like 4 or so Tron players in top 8, of course all with no maps. So I just want to get into a list that I think is solid. And we'll go from there. So starting with the mana, of course we have the 4 Ephemerate Tron lands, so 4 Power Plant, 4 Urza's Tower, and 4 Urza's Mine. No reason not to play all 4 of these. Then we have 4 Thriving Isle. I know these look like remote isles, but they're actually Thriving Isles. The new tap land from the Jumpstart set. So if you haven't been following the latest card releases, it's a blue land, comes into play tapped. When it comes into play, you choose any color, and then it taps for either blue or whatever color that you chose. So compared to a land like Thornwood Falls, it doesn't gain you life, but it can be blue and then any color that you choose. So in aggro matchups, you can name like green or white to help your Stonehorns and your fog spells. And then in like Delver matchups with the mirror, you can name red for all your Pyroblast and things. So that flexibility is worth the fact that it doesn't gain 1 life. Then I'm also playing 4 islands. Hasten top 8 or top 4, I think, the challenge today with a list that played no islands, just played way more tap lands. I don't think I like that list, but it's close, and I'll talk about why in a minute. That because obviously whether you have like so many lands that come and play tapped on turn 1 affects whether you can play like 1-drop spells. And then I have 1 Cave of Temptation and 1 Thornwood Falls. So some players, at least the ones that are playing islands, will either play like 4 islands and 2 Cave of Temptation, or like they'll cut the 4th island for a 2nd Cave of Temptation. I don't really think the deck needs 2 Cave so much. It's really backbreaking when you draw multiple now, because you can't reliably get fast Tron mana anymore. So if like all of your colored sources are caves, it's pretty hard to cast your spells. So I have another tap land instead. Why this is blue-green is not really clear. Like, you're a very multicolored deck, so you could easily justify playing like the blue-red one instead, or just even another island maybe, but that's where I'm at with that at the moment. So 22 lands, that seems pretty common for most of the Tron decks that are doing well at the moment. So lands that aren't in the deck anymore, of course the deck's not playing any copies of actual Remote Isle, because you don't have map, so you can't search for it with your map when you're mana flooded. I think it would be reasonable to just play like 1 Remote Isle, like maybe instead of the Thornwood Falls, just as a bit of like flood insurance, but most people don't seem to be doing that right now. And the other land that I'm not playing is the Mortuary Mire. It loses a lot, again, when you can't play map, it loses a lot of utility when you can't search for it when you need it, when it's just a random black land in your deck that comes into play tapped. Maybe you draw it in a good situation, maybe you don't. It becomes much worse. Like, the utility of being able to find it with map was the main upside for the card. Of course, you could also use it with Flicker to stop yourself from decking out, but you have other ways to solve that problem anyway. So yeah, 22 lands. Moving on to the spells now. So, pretty common stock options are the 3 Wars. Some people try and play 2. I still think I like all 3. It's a pretty strong effect to have in the late game, so you want to be able to find it pretty easily when you need it. 4 Mulldrifter, of course, one of the best cards in the deck. And then I'm playing 4 Stonehorn Dignitary now. It's a proxy for a 4th Stonehorn. Looks a bit funny, but get over it. Yeah, so it's pretty common for these decks to play like 4 or 5 fog effects in the main, and then like 1 or 2 more on the sideboard. So I'm playing 4 Stonehorns. I think Stonehorn is pretty solid. Compared to playing a bunch of like Moments Piece, you want to be able to like. I think it's easier to set up the lock with the Stonehorn compared to something like, well, compared to Moments Piece or another fog spell. When you have like a very minimal number of Stonehorns, and you're trying to play so many flickers to also enable all your like Mulldrifter and walls and things, often your flickers become a bit too dead. So I think that's the main reason why I prefer leaning more towards Stonehorns rather than the instant spells. Like there are some builds that play like a roughly even split of like 2 Stonehorns, then like 2 fog spells, or like 3 fog spells and then only 1 Stonehorn, things like that. But I think having more ways to enable your flickers makes me prefer Stonehorn. There's also like the sort of other factors to consider, that like just the fact that it's a body makes it slightly better versus Delver, and then it also stops flaring pain, whereas the fog spells don't, and also yeah, I think that's the main reasons for preferring Stonehorn over the fog spells. So yeah, these are the only creatures I'm playing. A lot of the lists now are not playing Dinrover Horror anymore, and I'm not either. Like I said, these are the only creatures. The reason why is that without map, the deck normally assembles the Tron lands like 1 or 2 turns later on average, maybe sometimes 3. So you can't reliably use Dinrover as a way to stabilize versus aggro decks. Because before you could kind of like turn 1 map, turn 2 Tron land, find the next Tron land, then turn 3 you'd have the fast mana, you play like a Prism, and then like turn 4 you'd play a Horror, and then like bounce their whatever attacker, like their dude with the Rancor on it or whatever, and then you'd be in a sort of like stable position. But you can't reliably do that quickly anymore. So it's just sort of this like late game bomb that helps you win in games you've already stabilized, and I don't really think that's good enough anymore. It's sort of like a high roll card in the mirror, because obviously Dinrovering their lands is very good, but I don't think that's necessary, and I think it costs you too much in the matchups where it's much weaker now, and it seems like a lot of people are having success without using it, so I'm pretty confident to cut it. Some people are playing 1 copy on the sideboard, just as like a trump for the mirror. I think that's fine, but I don't really think you need it main deck. If you want to play play it main deck, I think you just play 1. So yeah, those are the creatures. Then the artifacts. So of course map is gone from the picture now. So we only have 8 artifacts. The 4 Prophetic Prism, and the 4 Bonder's Ornament. So again, this is another new card from the Ikoria Commander. So what this does, it's like a JM Day Tome. 3 mana, you can tap it for 1 mana of any color, so it's like a Monolith or a Darksteel Ingot. And then it has the ability pay 4 and tap it. Each player who controls a permanent named Bonder's Ornament draws a card. So if you have an ornament and your opponent doesn't, then only you draw a card. So it's like a JM Day Tome. And if both you and your opponent have an ornament, then you both draw a card. So then it's like a Howling Mine. It lets the deck play more of a control kind of role. I mean, it really augments like both plans of the deck, right? Because if you're spending Ghostly Flicker. Well, that's not the best example, right? Because if you have Wall, and then, so like say you don't have a Wall, but you have like Flicker and Stonehorn, then you can burn the Flicker to just fog for 1 turn, and then you'll have this to replace the Flicker. So you keep drawing, you hopefully chaining cards and getting towards the lock. And then in the matchups where it's more about like trading 1 for 1 with like counter spells and Pyroblast and stuff, it also just is like an incremental source of card advantage. So it helps like either plan you're going for. And then it's also just like a mana fixer, which is really important for the deck as well, obviously. So yeah, I play 4. Some people are only playing 3, but I think it's too strong. I think like the mana fixing ability plus the card draw is like everything the deck wants. So yeah, 4 of that card. Then onto the spells. So this is where we sort of get to the most interesting options of the deck. I think everybody's playing 2 teachings still. You search for all of your spells that you need. Flashback, so like good versus counter spells. You chain them together, blah blah blah. Everybody knows why that card is good. I think I would say most people are playing the 1 copy of Compulsive Research. It's just a good card advantage spell in the mid game, and then in games where you're playing against elves and they have like 500 life or whatever, or anything weird like that, you can loop it with Wall targeting your opponent and make them deck out. So it's important to have that angle as well. Then sort of what the map replacement was. Everybody seems to be playing about 6-ish kind of cantrip effects. So what I have is, so we have the Compulsive Research, which kind of counts. It's like a card filtering effect. I'm playing 4 Ponder. I know these look like Witching Wells. No, sorry, not Ponder. I know these look like Witching Wells, but they're actually Preordains. 4 Preordains. Then 1 Forbidden Alchemy and 1 Impulse. So this is what I was getting at when I was talking about the mana base and playing 4 islands. So the thing about island, like, it comes into play untapped in the mid game, which can be important. So you don't have so many tap lands in your deck when you're trying to like curve out and cast like your Stonehorn on turn 4. And then Island will also let you play a 1 mana spell on turn 1. So with the Preordain, obviously that's pretty important. And the other reason why Preordain is nice, like having 1 mana spells, is because when you tap out for Ornament, it can add 1 mana of any color. So it's good if you have 1 mana spells that you can spend that mana on, right? So if in like the interim on like turn 2, maybe you drew the Preordain, but you didn't play it on turn 2 because you had like Prophetic Prism or something else to cast instead. Then on turn 3 you play this, then you tap it and Preordain, and you're making the best use of your mana. So yeah, I think Preordain is good. The list with all the tap lands, they're obviously not trying to play a 1 mana spell on turn 1, so they tend to play way more Impulse instead. It obviously digs a bit deeper than Preordain, and it's a bit more flexible because it's an instant. And I could see that being quite strong as well. You know, this is, people are having like a bit of success with a lot of different lists right now, and it's hard to figure out exactly what's the best option. But I think having all the Preordains seems pretty good to me at the moment. The Alchemy is a bit optional, I think. The Alchemy could be even like another Impulse, or Another impulse. I guess you could even play Witching Well in the deck if you wanted. Like, you have the mana to activate it pretty easily in a lot of spots, and it's even like a flicker target as well. You can just target it with a flicker to get the value scry if you need to cycle your flicker out of your hand. But yeah, probably just more copies of impulse is what I would use if I wanted to cut the alchemy. Ponder's not as good in this deck because you don't have shuffle effects to fine-tune the cards that you want off it. People play 4 Ponder always in Legacy, for example, and like Preordain is the next one after that if you want more cantrips. But in Legacy you have so many copies of the fetch lands to shuffle your library for no cost. So if you ponder and you see like 3 cards that you ponder and you see 3 cards and you want like only one of them or 2 of them, then you draw the ones that you want, and then before you draw the one that you don't want, you activate your fetch land to shuffle your library. You can't do that in Pauper, so just having the spell that lets you choose exactly which ones you want to put on top and bottom is the better option. You could even play Opt, but I don't think the flexibility of being an instant is worth the fact that it only scries 1. That's a pretty big drawback, I think, when you're trying to find Tron lands and things like that. So yeah, these are like the card fixing spells, along with, I guess you can put the teachings and the compulsive research in that category as well. Yeah, so remember these are preordains, and then 1 impulse, 1 alchemy, 2 teachings, and the research. Then most people play 2 counterspells main. Some people playing actual counterspell, which I don't like. I think it's a little bit greedy. You don't have that many blue sources in the deck, and you have Memory Lapse as a spell which can counter anything anyway. And then Prohibit's like pretty common counterspell. Like, I think most decks will be playing at least 1 copy of Prohibit. So yeah, 2 counters seems like a reasonable number. I kind of want to play an Exclude main deck, and I'll talk about that when I get to the sideboard. The only other option that I'd really consider playing main is Condescend, but it's just not that good, I don't think. Especially when the mirror is so popular, it can become a bit awkward when both players have a lot of mana. Trying to navigate situations with a Condescend, so I'm not a big fan of it. Dispel main is another interesting thing, because I'm not playing crop rotation because I don't think it's very good, but some people are, and just having Dispel main deck is like a good way to fight that. But again, these are already pretty solid versus that card. Just having a 2 mana counterspell for crop rotation, and the Dispel is a bit narrow in some matchups. Like, you don't have a very good use for it versus things like Stompy, and even versus Boros is probably not that great. Like, it just counters a bolt at your face, and it's in game 1 anyway. So yeah, just the Memory Lapse and the Prohibit I think is fine. And again, maybe an Exclude if you can fit it, but I don't currently have one at the moment. Then for the flicker effects, usually people play 3 total. Sometimes that's 2 Ephemerate, 1 flicker. Sometimes it's 2 flicker, 1 Ephemerate. I've got two same as the deck I played before, 2 flicker, 1 Ephemerate. This is just the split that I prefer. Yeah, the Ghostly Flicker is more powerful in the late game, and it's also easier to cycle it in the mid game when you don't really have anything going on, because you can target prisms with it. It's the main reason why I prefer 2 of this and 1 of this. I don't think I'd want to play fewer of this, because that's too important to help you stack your Stonehorns, or chain them at multiple turns in a row, like how I sort of talked about that before, and making sure your late game gets online easily. This card's pretty important as well. So 3 flickers, I think that's okay. You can try to cut 1 flicker if you want, but I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah. So, of course, one fog spell to go with your mystical teachings. I'm playing the one Tangle like I was before. Yeah, like I say in my previous videos, when I'm only playing one fog spell main, I want it to be a Tangle rather than a Moment's Peace. If you want to play two fog spells main, then I think they should both be Moment's Peace. Because if you want to loop this with the Mnemonic Wall, then if you only have one copy of it and you flashback it, then it's gone forever, you can't loop it. So Tangle is just the most powerful fog effect that doesn't exile itself. So one Tangle. Then the last few slots are like kind of flexible. So what you'll often see is in Tron decks is one or two copies of Pulse of Marasa as life gain and as a way to return creatures. Sometimes you'll also see Weather the Storm as a life gain effect, just as like a huge life gain that can be good versus Burn or Delver or lots of different things. So I'm still playing one Weather the Storm, and I'm also playing a slightly different effect that returns creatures from the graveyard, which has sort of become a lot more popular recently. It's Reaching the Graves. So this is also a card that has Storm. It costs 3 mana, 2 and a black, and it's Raise Dead or Disentomb. Return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, but it has Storm. So for every spell played before it in the turn, you get another copy of it. The reason why this card is so good is because in the mirror matches, or especially post-board games when they were playing against decks that have a bunch of counter spells and things, often what games come down to is like fighting over who can stick Mnemonic Wall and a flicker. So for example, if your opponent counters your Mnemonic Wall and then they counter your Pulse of Marasa, in that case often you're stuck. Like what you wanted to get the card advantage from your Mnemonic Wall resolving, and then you flicker your Mnemonic Wall and you get infinite card advantage, but what happened was they 1-for-1 your Mnemonic Wall and then they 1-for-1 your way to get it back, and without any like follow-up, you're just like dead in the water kind of. So instead, how this works is it's basically like a Pulse of Marasa that's uncounterable, because as long as you played like 1 or 2 spells in the turn before it in the turn, there's no way your opponent's going to have counters for all of the copies. So you can return like 2 Mnemonic Walls and a Mulldrifter or whatever, and then you're like way ahead of all of your opponent's resources, and you can hopefully resolve one of them, right? Like, and then you only need to resolve 1 more Mnemonic Wall and you can get this back, and then you have that whole engine going again. So there's an argument that because this is like only good in games your opponent's trying to fight you with counterspells so hard, that maybe this should be better as a sideboard card, and like Pulse of Marasa would be like a more generic kind of effect that's more suitable for the main deck. But most people are having good success with the main deck Reaping the Graves at the moment, so I think I'd like to try that as well. And then you can make an argument that the deck doesn't really need life gain main, I guess, but like you're flying a bit too close to the sun with that one, I think. Like in some matchups, Weather the Storm is obviously not very good because all it does is gain life, and in some matchups that doesn't really matter. But most of the time you can usually find a way to leverage your life lead. So, and in some matchups obviously it's critical, so I think it's fine to play 1 copy of Weather the Storm main deck, even though in some matchups it's a bit blank. So then we have 2 more slots left. So without the Din Rover Horror, a lot of people are playing like Burn Finisher. So really commonly that's Rolling Thunder. So red X deals X damage divided among any target creatures or players. Obviously in the late game that's really strong because it's like a big board wipe. They can kill like a whole board full of creatures, or you can just tap all of your Tron lands and deal 20 damage to the opponent's face. That's a pretty common option to use. Another one is just a lightning bolt, because you can, in the late game when you have control, when you've like got a handful of counter spells and flicker and everything, so your opponent can't really resolve a spell, and they can't attack you because you're looping your Stonehorn, blah blah blah. Like you can just bolt your opponent, Ephemerate your wall, get your bolt back, bolt your opponent, and eventually they're gonna die from that. And the reason why bolt would be better than Rolling Thunder is because in the early game you can just play like a Thriving Isle on turn 1, name red, untap, and then shoot their ninja or their delver or their Spellstutter Sprite or their Axebane Guardian or anything like that. So I think you want to play a card like this in the deck. Just to give you a way to close out games, a way to disrupt creatures, and I think both of these options are like totally defensible. But because I'm stupid and I like to play silly cards, what I have here is one copy of Resounding Thunder, so not quite Rolling Thunder. What this does is it has 2 modes basically. So the first mode is 3 mana Lightning Bolt, so instant 3 damage to any target, 2 in a red. So that's obviously not that great, because you could just play Lightning Bolt, which is 2 mana cheaper. And then it has a secondary quote unquote mode. You can cycle it for 8 mana, so 5 black, red, green. And when you cycle it, it deals 5 damage to any target. So the reason why that's kind of interesting is that in that kind of like late game situation when you're only using it to finish your opponent, it replaces itself, which is obviously nice, and deals damage in 5 damage chunks. So like that's slightly more convenient maybe. But then the other thing is that in matchups like Delver, for example, it's because the damage is attached to the cycling trigger and it's not a spell, it's basically uncounterable in Pauper. So, as long as you have the mana, this is like uncounterable cantrip, destroy target Gurmag Angler, which is pretty interesting, I think. In some matchups that could be like a pretty reasonable thing to be doing. And then it still has the like Bolt-esque kind of mode where it's still like a relatively early game answer for things like Ninja of the Deep Hours or Axebane Guardian. So I think this is like worth a try. I mean, it's possible that like both modes are just too overcosted, and then I should just pick like one of either Rolling Thunder or Bolt. I think I prefer Bolt, but either one is again like a totally defensible choice. And the last card I'm playing is one Capsize. So without Denrova Horror, you still want to have some answers to your opponent's permanents. So like if you play a wall and your opponent like journeys to nowhere's it, or your opponent plays like a Boros Garrison and you want to just cheese them out by bouncing it, that's still something you can do. And you can also use it as a flicker effect that circumvents Graveyard Hate, because you can target as long as you have enough mana, obviously, you can target your own Stonehorns and walls with buyback, and your Capsize never goes to the graveyard, so they can't hit it with like a Relic or a Tormod Script or anything like that. So I think this is a nice sort of like flexible one of. Obviously the card's sort of like always been around, and except for the fact that you can't play Denrova, or not you can't, but you don't want to play Denrova Horror anymore, there's not really any clear reason why it would have become a lot better suddenly. But I do think having answers to permanence is good. So I think it's like a okay choice. Again, in those kind of situations where you don't have Denrova and you just want to fight something and like just using it as like a 3 mana unsummon is not great, but again, fine. You just want to like delay the game until you get your Tron mana and your ornaments online. So yeah, that's the main deck. I think that most of the playmat is in the frame, so I'll just sort of deal that out right now. Hopefully the glare is not too bad because I'm recording indoors at night, so I have to have the lights on. So maybe you can't see this so well, but I just want to have all the cards out so I can talk, when I'm talking about the sideboard, I can pick things up and talk about them. So yeah. And then these are all the lands, and they're not that important, so I won't show those. The sideboard. So, and again, like, even though everybody's list is a bit different in one way or another, like generally, people sort of have the cards that occupy the same kind of role, right? So the 22 lands is basically stock. Like 5 Fog Effect's main deck is pretty stock. So here I have like 4 Stonehorn and then the 1 Tangle. So even though some people might have like 2 Stonehorns and 3 Moments Peace or something, like that's sort of all part of the same like strategy. 3 War and Mulldrifter is like again stock. 4 Prism, 4 Ornament is again stock. You have about like 6 or 7 card draw, like cantripy card filtering spells. That's pretty stock as well, even if you're not playing exactly for Preordain, Impulse, Alchemy, Research. You know, like you probably have like some 6 or 7 cards that have like similar effect to that. The 2 counter spells, the 2 teachings, 3 flickers, some graveyard return / life gain cards, whether you have like Pulse of Morasses or like this, you have the Reaping the Graves and the Weather the Storm. And then you have like 1 Burny finisher thing, like Rolling Thunder usually, and then I guess this is just an extra flicker, which again some people might have. Some people might have like 2 flickers and 2 ephemerates. So here we have like 2 flicker, 1 ephemerate, 1 capsize. So yeah, you know, like generally all of the Tron decks, well, like there's a lot, seems to be a lot of like personal preference within individual card choices. Like they're generally all built to the sort of same kind of shell. And the sideboard again is like sort of similar in that regard. So I have 4 Hydros, 4 Hydroblast. Your burn matchup got a little bit better, I think, when you have Preordain instead of map, because again that's the kind of matchup where having a lot of mana early doesn't really help you much. You just want to make sure you don't die really fast, which means that like playing a blue land on turn 1 and then Preordaining into a Hydroblast is really good. So yeah, that matchup might have even got slightly better with all of these changes, but you're a lot weaker to smash the Smithereens now because you have the Bonder's Ornament, which is like a 3 mana artifact that gets pretty heavily punished by it. So you want to be able to have Hydros, so you can tap out for this, and then if they try to smash it, you pay blue and then Hydro to counter the smash. And yeah, again, like Hydro, you just need more answers to burn stuff. It's just not the greatest matchup. So having the Weather main deck helps sometimes as well, but I still think like 4-ish Hydros are needed. Remember, you can always play more if you want to, because Blue Elemental Blast is legal as well. Then 4 Pyroblast is pretty common, or again sometimes even more. This looks like a green card, but it's a proxy for another Hydroblast. I mean another Pyroblast. So yeah, 4 Hydroblast, 4 Pyroblast. And again, you can play Red Elemental Blast too if you want. So these are like anti-counterspell options, and they're also just removal versus Delver decks. Yeah, again, a very powerful card for 1 mana. So that's for the 4 Hydras and the 4 Pyros. 1 Dispel. So just a slightly more flexible option versus instants that aren't red or blue. So the specific examples would be like crop rotation, which I mentioned before. Being able to counter that can be really strong in the mirror. Because obviously trading 1 mana for 1 mana, 1 card for 1 card, but then their second land is very punishing. And then also counting your opponent's Ephemerates can be pretty important as well. So yeah, a lot of the instances that you want to counter are blue, so like Pyroblast does a good job of that, and it also counters things like Mnemonic Wall and Mulldrifter. So in a lot of ways Pyroblast is better, and that's why we're playing more. But there are some cases where Dispel can be like a little bit clutch. So and that's another situation, like in the blue mirrors, you'll board in all of your Pyroblast, and your opponent will board in Pyroblast also. Like you don't want to board in Hydroblast just for their Pyroblast because it's a bit narrow, but like having a card that can counter Pyroblast but can also counter like a normal counter spell, like Prohibit or whatever, that's obviously good. So you have the 4 Pyroblast and the Dispel. Then 1 more fog effect in the board is pretty common to bring it up to like 6 or 7 in the whole 75. So 1 Moment's Peace. So this is the actual Moment's Peace, unlike my Pyroblast proxy Moment's Peace. So we're up to 4, 8, 9, 10 cards now. 1 board wipe is pretty stock. In the past, it was usually an Electricity, which is what I have sleeved up right now. Another card that's come out recently in Ikoria is Suffocating Fumes, which is 2 and a black instant. All creatures your opponents control, so it's not symmetrical. 2 and a black instant. All creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn, and it has cycling for 2 mana. So that effect is pretty solid. If you want to play it main deck, I think it's pretty good because in the matchups where it's dead, you can cycle it. And versus Boros Bully, unlike Electricity, it gets around Prismatic Strands because it gives all the tokens -1 and it's not damage. But in the sideboard, the cycling effect is not necessarily that important because you're only boarding it in matchups where presumably you want the board wipe effect, and you won't be in situations where you want to cycle it. Like if you board in a board wipe and find yourself in a game state where you don't need a board wipe, you're probably already winning that game anyway. So the fact that it costs 3 mana instead of 2 might be more important. But the other card that a lot of people are trying right now is Scattershot. So this is a 3 mana instant, 2 and a red. Deals 1 damage to target creature, and it has Storm. So again, like Reaping the Graves, the reason why this effect is good is because the Storm makes a ton of copies. It's very hard to stop with counter magic, because obviously your opponent needs to counter all of the different copies. So against Delver is where that's really important. You play a couple spells before this, and your opponent's thinking, yeah, okay, I'll let that Preordain resolve, I'll let that Prism resolve, I don't care about those spells. But then suddenly you play a Scattershot, and you target like 3 damage to their ninja or whatever, and then like 1 damage on each of a couple of fairies. And then they're in like a pretty awkward position where like maybe they can save like 1 of their creatures, but it's not that good of a trade for them. So that's why a lot of people have been favoring Scattershot as their like sideboard board wipe of choice. The reason why you would prefer to play a card like Electricity or maybe Suffocating Fumes is against elves, because it's often very difficult to cast enough spells where Scattershot becomes like a meaningful removal. Like you might be able to only, because against like a Delver deck, if you kill like 2 or 3 of their creatures only, then you know that's probably pretty good. But against a deck like Elves, maybe that's not enough, and it's very hard for you to cast like 10 spells in one turn to kill like a really big Elves board. Whereas you play something like Electrickery or Suffocating Fumes, it just kills all the 1/1s, no questions asked. So that's what you would consider there. I'm not exactly sure which one I'd rather play. The other pro for Suffocating Fumes compared to Electrickery is that if you suspect your opponent will have a card like Rapid Vigor or something that like regenerates all their creatures, then Suffocating Fumes will get past that, whereas Electrickery will fail. So all of those will like be defensible choices, I think. But playing one kind of board wipe effect in the sideboard is pretty stock. I think if you wanted, you could find space to play both. Like you have Scattershot and Electrickery versus like Delver, and then versus something like Elves, you just have the Electrickery. That could also work, but again, you just have to find a way to make space. Then one Ancient Grudge. I think this is probably a very solid choice in terms of artifact removal right now. A lot of people have been experimenting with different kinds of artifact removal in the sideboard, because before you only needed artifact removal for, well, maybe as like an anti-relic option, but the other thing was like an anti-affinity card maybe, and that was like roughly it. You didn't really want to board it in against Boros because it was not really the kind of access you wanted to try and fight them on. And you didn't really want to board it in against the Mirror because like hitting a Prism with it wasn't very meaningful, and like you wouldn't really be able to hit them with hit a map with it unless you got super lucky. So they weren't really very good targets for it in the Mirror. Of course, that's all totally changed now because of Bonder's Ornament. Firstly, it's 3 mana to cast, so it's a pretty big punish if you answer it for like only 2 mana. And of course, Ancient Grudge is pretty hard to counter as well because it has flashback. And winning the war over the Bonder's Ornaments can be pretty significant because just because of how the card works. Like if you both have them, then they're basically disabled, because paying 4 mana for both players to draw a card is not a very good use of your resources, basically. Like your opponent's getting a card for free, you're getting a card, but you had to pay 4 mana. It's just like not a very good exchange. So making sure that you have ornaments and your opponent doesn't is a pretty important part of the mirror match now. So again, so you got to think about like what artifact card do you want to play in your sideboard. So Ancient Grudge can be pretty good. I've seen some people try Dismantling Blow, which is 2 and a white for an instant destroy artifact or enchantment. And it has kicker 2 and a blue, and if you kicker it, you draw 2 cards. I think that's a little bit greedy. I don't think I'd want to play an effect like that. I think you want to be able to answer the ornaments for a cheap amount of mana. So I think Ancient Grudge is good. Shattering Pulse is another effect that people have been trying. I think that could be okay as well. I might like to try that. Some people are playing like 1 Ancient Grudge and like 1 Gorilla Shaman. I don't know if that's maybe more as like an anti-affinity hedge, but because your deck makes so much mana, having like a permanent answer to like all future Bonder's Ornaments could be like a pretty strong asset to have. So yeah, so usually one like Ancient Grudge plus 1 more anti-artifact card like a Gorilla Shaman or a Shattering Pulse is like a pretty reasonable choice as well. At the moment I just have 1 Ancient Grudge, but I think I have 1 like open slot in my sideboard that could be something else. Then 1 Exclude. Again, it's like a strong card to have in the mirror when you want to be fighting over your opponent's Mulldrifters and walls and things, like Counterspell, draw a card. It's just a really strong effect. What I was considering is finding a way to maybe play this card main deck. So I have the Weather the Storm and Reaping the Graves main deck, and of course what I said was like the importance of Reaping the Graves is like seen a lot more in sideboard games rather than mainboard games. So I thought maybe you cut both of these, play one Positive Marasa, to like get the combined effects of both these cards, and then play one Exclude main deck as well. That's something I'd like to consider, but at the moment I'm just playing the Exclude in the side, just for those games where you don't really want to try and play that like tap out and jam style in the sideboard matches so much, because you can get really punished by Pyroblasts. So you do want to kind of play more of a style where you like sit back, you try and build up like counters and not make the first move so often, and you try and fight over your opponent's resources with a bunch of like grindy instants like Ancient Grudge and things. So Exclude is really good for those kind of matchups, or those situations rather. So one Exclude in the 75 seems like a solid choice. Then the one sideboard slot a lot of people are using on like a Dinroba Horror or some like big bomb, big mana card to just sort of have like a trump for the matchups where your opponent doesn't pressure you too much and they let you get to that kind of late game situation. So I think Dinroba Horror is like okay. Obviously it's like a proven card, it has like a solid track record, like we all know what Dinroba Horror does. The card that I kind of want to try in that space instead is this one, Entourage of Trest. So what this does, it's a 5 mana 4/4 creature, so like 4 and a green. When it comes into play, you become the Monarch, and when you are the Monarch, it can block 2 creatures per combat rather than just one like a normal creature can. But that part of the effect is not that important. So the reason why this card is nice, compared to the other Monarch creatures, it costs 1 more. Technically you can play all of the Monarch creatures in Pauper now without figuring out how to get the red one online, but obviously the white one and the black one are considered the best because they cost 4, not 5. So this one costs 5, so you know, and you could obviously cast Palace Sentinels or Thorn of the Black Rose pretty easily in this deck, because you can cast any color of spell. The reason why I like Entourage of Trest is because it has 4 power. So in matchups, again, in those matchups where you just sort of like want to sit back, not commit too much, and sort of like build up enough counter spells that you can like force a fight on your own terms once you're like confident you have enough backup counter magic to win over like a Mulldrifter or a Mnemonic Wall or something like that. In those kind of games, this is like one of the things you want to be fighting over, because your opponent's not going to be attacking you much like in this kind of mirror match. So the Monarch token's not going to be pressured too much. And because it has 4 power, it can attack pretty well into things like opposing Mnemonic Walls or Stonehorns if they have any left after sideboarding. And then it's green, so you can't Hydroblast it or Pyroblast it. It costs 5, so this seemed like a downside because it becomes more expensive, but it puts it out of Prohibit range as well, which is like another thing that's sort of worth thinking about. Of course, Dinroba Horror would do that too because it costs 6, but you can Pyroblast a Dinroba Horror, so that's a relevant drawback. And yeah, it just lets you grab the Monarch, so you get your own little personal Howling Mine, and you can just keep drawing up more Pyroblast or whatever to like protect it and stop your opponent from playing a wall or anything that would let them lock up the game. And because it has, and then you can keep attacking, and because it has 4 power, it doesn't get blanked by a Stonehorn or a Mnemonic Wall. So yeah, nobody's really likes to play Monarch cards in Tron before, and I think especially not in the main deck, it's too much of a risk, because you don't want to play this kind of card that only really helps when you're already winning. But in some matchups, your opponent's really not going to be pressuring you much or at all, and just having this kind of effect to draw an extra card every turn, plus you get like a big threat, I think could be strong. But if that turns out not to be the case, then I think this card should just be a Dinner Over Horror. The other kind of effect like this, like the big mana, the big mana Tron Mirror rando high roll card that I've played in the past is, of course, the Scour from Existence. So the 7 mana exile your land effect. I think this card is still fine. Like, not many other people seem to appreciate it that much, it doesn't seem. But it's very flexible. Again, because it's colorless, you can't Hydro or Pyroblast it, which is pretty valuable in the mirror match. So that could be an option as well. I wouldn't, yeah, so you probably don't want to play both of this kind of card. Like, probably just pushes your mana curve up too high. You probably just want to find some effect like this that you want and then just play one of it. Yeah, so I'll just run through the sideboard again. So 4 Pyro, 4 Hydro, Dispel, 1 Fog Effect, so a Moment's Peace, 1 Board Wipe, 1 Artifact Destruction card, 1 Exclude, 1 big mana bomb card, and then probably either another Board Wipe or another Artifact Hate card. That's how I'd build it, I think. Oh, that's the other thing, is that this is a big threat that doesn't use the graveyard. And what some people are doing now in the Tron mirrors is they are using crop rotation with Bajuka Bog as a way to like fight the graveyard in the mirror match. And this, of course, this is something that can give you repeated advantage that doesn't care about that. Whereas if you like do something like you play it in Over Horror and then you try and flicker it and then they counter exile your flicker, well, then you're stuck, right? So this is like a solid snowbally card just all by itself. So that's another feather in the cap of the entourage. So yeah, I think that's oh yeah, and just a reminder of the other suggestion I thought of before, like you could put these 2 cards, the Reaping the Graves and the Weather, in the board. Then you play Exclude and Pulse main deck, and then you have to cut the second copy of the second Artifact Hate card or the second Board Wipe card. That would be the other thing that I'd want to try as well. Because Exclude in the main deck is like a pretty strong card in a lot of matchups. And Pulse is just like, in a lot of situations, game 1, Pulse is like, you know, you don't really need to Reaping the Graves for like 3 creatures. You can just Pulse 1 back and that's fine, because you mainly just want to use it to have a way to keep chaining Mnemonic Walls if they kill them. And then as a life gain spell, it's like pretty effective as a life gain spell. 6 lives quite a lot, but also matches where your life total doesn't matter. It's just like a more useful card. You know, it's not card disadvantage. You're getting something back from your graveyard. So that's the other configuration I would want to try with this deck. But yeah, so Tron, despite the illegal maps out of the picture, still seems like the deck has a lot of power, and they can definitely have a lot of success in the new Pauper metagame. So that has been Life by TCG, signing out.